Hello, and welcome to our very first community conversation, Camas, So You Want to Talk About Equity and Education. My name is Jackie. I'm the owner of LiveWell Camas in downtown Camas, Washington. LiveWell is a movement and yoga studio, but more than that, we are a community gathering place where we are creating space for brave conversations to happen. The idea for this once a month conversation series began because I am a person that has a lot of questions. I want to know about everything. I figured if I have these questions about something, that there are other folks out there that do too. And while I might be a person that has time and resources and the ability to research the questions that I have, I also recognize that there are folks that are not able to do this and that it can be overwhelming at times. We are kicking this series off with an important and somewhat hot button topic, because I've been closely watching what has been happening here in our local community, as well as across the nation in the conversation of critical race theory. I noticed that there was a need here in our local community and beyond of a place where people could gather nonpartisan information about what exactly CRT is, and more importantly, is not, as well as ask questions and gain insight into why it is an important topic. We are joined tonight by Dr. Donna Sinclair, who is a history professor with Washington State University, Vancouver, and Western Oregon University. She is an author, a mother, a grandmother, and has served on the Washougal School District Board of Education since 2017. She is legislative liaison for the district, is active with the State School Director Association, serves on the Equity Advisory Team, and the Government to Government Committee for Tribal Sovereignty. Beyond this, Donna is also a museum professional, presents public history programs, has taught teacher workshops with ESD 112, has worked with local museums to curate exhibits, and co-led the collaborative Clark County Stories Community Conversations Project. Her community service centers around education and mentoring students, and she has received several awards. Donna holds a bachelor's degree from WSUV and earned a master's degree in history and a PhD in urban studies from Portland State University. Hi, Donna.
Hi, Jackie. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to have you presenting for this first conversation. Before we get going, can you share just a little bit about how we connected and why you wanted to be involved in this conversation?
Sure. Well, first of all, I really appreciate that you are providing a neutral space for having conversations that are difficult and challenging in our communities. I noticed, and I can't remember exactly where it was, but I saw that you were talking about doing something like this and offering the studio for a conversation. And so because of both my service on the Washougal School Board and because I come from a university background with some familiarity with some of the issues that are arising right now, I offered to do this. I had been thinking a lot about it and preparing. And so I have my master's in history has had me employed for the last 22 years. So I'm a public historian. I'm an oral historian. I do a lot of interviewing with people. And then I also, through my advanced, through the PhD program, it's a social sciences interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary degree, which means that I was in the room with a lot of people with a lot of different backgrounds. And so I had some familiarity with theory, a lot with theory. And then this question of critical race theory came up. And that was really confusing for me because I barely heard of it. And a lot of people that I knew didn't know it very well. But I had some familiarity. I'll talk about that later. So that's why I wanted to get involved. One of the things I was hoping is that if the folks who are here, who are listening in, if you would be willing to put in, are you a teacher, a parent, a school board director, and maybe what city you're in, because we're live streaming out of Camas. I'm in Washougal, and we hope that there are people from all around Clark County and maybe even elsewhere who are here to just learn a little bit about what we know about these issues with equity in education. And who are you? So we hope this can be as interactive as possible when we're not in the same room. So I see Rob Perkins, who is also a school board director in Evergreen. Thank you, Rob, for coming. Wendy, great. Hello. Alyssa Wells, thank you so much for coming, Alyssa. Okay, great. So I'm going to, intermittently, maybe I'll ask you some questions. If there are particular topics that you would like to hear about, let me know. I will stop intermittently and see if there are any questions I can answer. Hopefully a lot of what you'll be asking I've already covered or will cover in my presentation. So that's my goal, but I want us to be able to have a conversation here at the end. So with that, hi, Barb. Thanks for coming. Wonderful. And Patty?
Awesome.
Great, great. Okay. Well, are we ready to get started, or did you have any other questions, Jackie?
I think let's get going. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Jackie. Again, I really appreciate this. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and here we go. One moment. It takes a moment to do these things. Of course, you're all familiar with this. At this point in time, we are all familiar with how all of this works, right? So here's, of course, the title of our talk, and I like that this is the title of the series, located in Camas, and I know that there are going to be a lot of other things that we're going to be talking about. So I wanted to start by talking about the discussion goals. First of all, I'd like to clarify some of the issues around equity in education. We've been hearing a lot about it. I'm going to define and discuss critical race theory, and I'll tell you in a moment how I came across it in the first place. Trace the emergence of controversy over this term, the term critical race theory, in recent months. And I'm hoping that we can, I can hear concerns and that we can have a productive discussion that's really grounded in, civil discourse. So what I'd like for you all to think about, what are your goals for this talk? What is it that is important to you? So we're going to start by talking about what are some public schools doing. And the reason I say some public schools is because there's nothing happening universally that is related to equity, except that there's a kind of national conversation that's going on. So I really wanted to start with some keywords and some definitions. Now, these are definitions that are sort of generally accepted, but something for those of you who are interested in what's happening on school boards, something you should know is that there is no generalized equity policy in the state of Washington out of the Washington State School Director Association. Each district crafts its own equity policy on its own in Washington State because it's so specific to the community. So what I'm going to be talking about here in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion is diversity as referring to variation among and between us. So from economic status to race, ethnicity, language, gender, ability, and diversity of thought, and maybe more. There might be other kinds of diversity that aren't included. Equity is a term that we're hearing bandied about a lot, and really at a very, very basic level, it means fairness, ensuring that every child has a fair shot at equal opportunity by eliminating barriers. Inclusion is referring to ensuring all students participate and are included in the education process, regardless of their background or ability. So for example, we have a unified sports team in Washougal that we're very, very proud of. And some of the things that public schools are doing are using demographic data to identify achievement gaps in order to address them. That's something that's been going on for quite a long time. Actually, since the 90s with the No Child Left Behind directive, we really started looking at numbers and identifying which populations of students were sort of predictably not achieving as well as others. So we can actually look at that and ask our question, or ask about how to create interventions that are helpful. Educating teachers to be culturally responsive to their students and recognize their own biases. So we're hearing a lot about things like cultural competence. So there's a recent law that was passed in the state legislature that talks about cultural competence, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there are some specific definitions that they use, but cultural competence generally refers to participating ethically and responsibly in personal and professional intercultural settings. So understanding children's histories and backgrounds. Different families have different cultures, different communities have different cultures. These are things that we want our teachers to understand. Trying to ensure equitable opportunities for all all kids. So making sure that every kid has a fair shot to be able to achieve that equal opportunity that we talk about so much. Re-examining policies and practices for biases that disproportionately affect some student populations to ensure equal opportunity. So things like testing costs can actually prevent kids who are very capable from doing things like taking exams like the AP exams. Dyslexia screening, this is something I'm personally familiar with. Dyslexia screening is something that a child in my family needed. It cost us $600 to be able to identify dyslexia. It's something that we are going to be implementing in our school district. So we're pretty excited about that. High cap, making sure that the kids that are highly capable also get the interventions that they need to succeed to the best of their abilities. And then reviewing history curriculum for inclusivity. That's something that some districts are doing, and it's something that a lot of people are talking about. We're going to talk more about history in just a moment. And then holding conversations about the world around us, educating our youth. Equitable does not mean socialist. It means fair. So that a kid, for example, who has parents who are addicted and aren't getting their kids to school, we're trying to make sure that those kids get to school. That's something that we did in our district last year. We had a re-engagement team for some of the kids who weren't tuning in, not because they didn't want to be at school so much as they didn't have the kind of family structures that a lot of people do. And, you know, we would want for all of our kids. So making sure that those kids can be engaged in school. So that's what I mean by that. And then what are we doing in schools? We're educating our youth and preparing them for the future. That's something that is really, really critical and key. That's our job, is to prepare kids for the future. So what critical race theory is not, and I'm going to talk about what it is in just a moment, is a public school curriculum. It is not a curriculum. There's no question about that. It wouldn't even make sense for it to me, and I'll talk about that in a moment. It's not anti-racism activism. There is anti-racism activism, but that's not critical race theory. It's not history curriculum. Historians actually write histories, and histories are taught in schools. That's not critical race theory. And diversity training is not critical race theory either. So those are things that are really important to understand, and I'm going to explain just a little bit more about that. So what is critical race theory? So critical race theory is an approach. It's what you call a theoretical lens, right? These are university concepts, and this is one that examines the role of the law and legal systems in upholding racial structures. It was introduced in the 1970s and the 1980s. Derek Bell is the originator, and there are a number of other academics who built on the things that he was talking about. Part of what was happening is that in the midst of the civil rights movement, there were the result of the civil rights movement really had a lot to do with some shifts in the law. So you can think about these are things we're all familiar with, right? Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. All of those things are tied into the civil rights movement at the time. And so there were changes in the law. And then there were scholars who started looking around and saying, yes, we have these changes in the law, but they haven't affected the kind of change that we would like to see, which is, of course, equal opportunity. That's the goal of the Civil Rights Act. So there were some changes in race relations through these laws and policies that prohibited discrimination in employment, housing, public accommodations, voting, etc. They started to make some changes. And it's important to acknowledge that the civil rights movement really existed on a continuum. The needle moved, but it was not a single moment in time. The civil rights movement wasn't something that just happened and was over. And it didn't just start in the 1960s. It's something that started far, far earlier than that. So critical race theory began with a group of legal scholars who looked at what is the law and how does the law uphold racist structures. Critical race theory provided that academic framework for analysis. of American society that examines why racial inequalities exist and tries to figure out what to do about them. It is an academic theory. You don't teach academic theories to school children. So that's why I say it is not something that's being taught. You don't teach chemical engineering to third graders. You don't teach critical race theory to children because it's something that's taught in law schools and in some graduate level programs. So it's actually scholars. I see somebody saying it's activism. There are activists that come out of critical race theory. There are activists that come out of a lot of different strains of intellectual trends. So you're absolutely right that it can be activism. But there are scholars, it's part of it. But it's not what's being taught in school, and it's actually not what informs everything about what you're hearing these days. And that's really important. This started in the late 1970s and really moved through the 1980s. And there's a lot of material that you can find out there. We don't teach racism as we shouldn't, which you're trying to push. So that's an interesting comment that I'm going to get to later because that's not really accurate. Okay. Here's my response to that. Ideas around critical race theory and are not new, and ideas around anti-racism are not new. This is not something that is new. There are overlapping ideas and understandings of how the world works. That's what social scientists do. And we have anthropologists and sociologists and political scientists and people from all kinds of disciplines who actually do that. Critical historians have long recognized the role of the law in shaping U.S. race relations. This is not something that's new. Critical race theory contributions have actually seeped into other disciplines. So one of them that you've probably heard about is the idea that race is a social construct. So that idea was developed out of looking at the law, but the Human Genome Project actually demonstrated, the science actually demonstrated that it's true. Oftentimes you might have someone who is African-American and someone who is, say, from Norway, and they might have a really close match, much closer than someone else who's African-American in the United States of America. So we see with the Human Genome Project that race is a social historical construct. History really reinforces the biological understanding, and this close examination of the law demonstrates the creation of these hierarchical systems. So history demonstrates how the systems work and how race and gender roles have been shaped through the law and society, through the ways that we interact in society. So social sciences and humanities have also borrowed from CRT. I'll just go ahead and call it CRT here, with a diffusion of ideas over time. So, you know, when you look at the way that intellectual activities happen in the university, there's a lot of discussion of ideas, and those discussions of ideas seep into one another and ultimately come into the mainstream. And that's what we've actually been seeing happening in recent years. So ideas like systemic racism have entered into the mainstream conversation across a lot of spectrums. We understand what's happening differently because of these theoretical perspectives, these different questions that are being asked. And so that's how science works too, right? We know that when it comes to science, that we might have learned some things and you build on the things that you learn. In the social sciences, there's cross-disciplinary fertilization might be a way to talk about it. So anti-racism has been ongoing in American history, and so has the backlash. Backlash to anti-racism is not new. So for example, efforts to abolish enslavement resulted in a ban on petitions against slavery in Congress. Congress actually said, no more petitions about slavery. We're not going to listen to them. We're not going to look at them in the 1830s. During Reconstruction, after the Civil War, so 1865 to 1877 is the Reconstruction era, efforts to achieve equality resulted in the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. That's when that happened. Efforts to eliminate racism and inequities continued throughout the 20th century, and anti-racist efforts continued all through the 20th century. It didn't just happen at one period of time with one law. It's been an ongoing civil rights movement that has been happening really since the inception of enslavement. So anti-racist ideas and issues that were raised in the civil rights era have achieved national attention recently. And it's because of what happened last summer with George Floyd's murder and all of the attention that got, and the backlash to that through protests and some of the rioting. All of those things happening at the same time meant that people were picking up books. They were paying a different kind of attention. And so there were discussions of things like white privilege, internalized racism, and this happened in popular literature. So you'll see here that I say, for example, white fragility, which a lot of you have probably heard of, is not CRT. CRT is something that is studied in law school. White fragility is anti-racism. Now, it may draw slightly from CRT, but it also draws from history and anthropology and our understandings about the world that are quite wide. So that's really important. These are popularized ideas, not something that's being taught in school necessarily. So I'm going to move forward here. So here's some of the ways that a CRT lens might be used in education and society. These are things that if you've been watching what's happening at your local school district, you may have heard about. We start asking questions, not just about race, but we started with that, right? Why race, economic status, language, and ability can actually predict things like discipline rates, even in preschool. African-American students have higher rates of discipline in preschool. There's nothing that explains that that is just immediately apparent. Graduation rates, academic program participation, other program participation. So sports, for example, we know that kids whose parents, a single parent, and I was actually a single parent, so let me just be clear about that, that sometimes when you don't have a good support system, it's hard to get your kids to the sports games, and those kids cannot participate in the same way. Dropout rates are different for different kids from different communities, and particularly, so in Washougal, for example, we can actually predict the outcomes for kids who don't speak English, who are differently abled, and kids who live in poverty. We can actually say, we are not surprised to see that the scores are lower. And we shouldn't be able to do that because it is our job as a board, as educators, to make sure that every kid has the opportunity and achieves their full potential, because kids are born with a lot of potential, but they have different kinds of lives that influence how they are able to participate. Critical race theory lens may also be used in society to ask why race, economic status, language, and ability can predict things like poverty rates, healthcare outcomes, prison rates, birth rates, COVID-19 impacts. It was no surprise to a lot of people who were paying attention that people of color had higher COVID death rates. And it should be a surprise. If everything's equal, then that would be ideal, right? So this sort of lens that looks at systems can help to identify problems and determine how to address them. Equity approaches in schools include race, but they also move beyond race. And so they focus on the needs of all children. So, and I'm coming back to this point because it is a really important point. I cannot say it enough. Critical race theory is not taught in schools. It is an academic framework that explains how systems, policies, and the law perpetuate systemic racism. And that, as I said, with the diffusion of ideas, that actually helps us to ask all kinds of questions. CRT does not promote victimization or identify children as oppressors and oppressed. It looks at systems. CRT is not about individuals, what it actually is. You have to remember that there are actually CRT theorists. There are people who say, I am a CRT scholar. Not me personally. I'm not a CRT scholar. I am a historian and a social scientist. There are people who identify in the law as CRT scholars. So CRT provides legal institutional analysis. It's not about those individuals. It's not about white guilt or white privilege or microaggressions. Now, you might have heard some of those things in diversity trainings. That's possible. Again, a lot of those ideas have been popularized and they're being adopted by a lot of people who are talking about them. That doesn't make them CRT. So the similarities in education and CRT are this analysis of systems and data to ensure that all students succeed. It's not anti-bias, anti-racism education, or culturally relevant teaching, DEI, diversity and inclusion training, multicultural education, or other anti-racism approaches. All of these movements draw from multiple sources. So that's how social sciences and humanities work, right? What do social sciences do? They actually describe how the world works. That's the idea. And so there are a lot of people trying to figure out, how do we work? So why is this happening now? A lot of it has to do with contested histories and a national culture. We are getting messaging from all over the country rather than focusing on our specific individual locales. So these contests over history are at the center of discussions around race. These contests over history have occurred for a long time. So they were pretty hot in the 1990s, which was another sort of turning point that I'm not going to get into unless somebody asks me to. Contests over history are hot again now. These contests over history are not contests about critical race theory. And I'll talk about why we're calling that in just a moment. So part of it is the 1619 Project, which was created in 2019. It was sponsored by the New York Times. And what it did is it placed slavery at the center of American history. It changed how we asked questions about the past. The project included curriculum, and there was a backlash against that. Nikole Hannah-Jones, who is a journalist, not a historian, but she's a journalist and a very good journalist, was granted a Pulitzer Prize for commentary in May of 2020. And she got a professorship at the University of North Carolina. So a lot of historians lauded the project. They thought it was pretty great. Others took issue with key interpretations around the nation's founding, but those historians who took issue with the interpretations did not take issue with facts around slavery or around the long-term impacts of slavery. Those things were not contested by historians. There was a lot of political pressure that was exerted on the University of North Carolina to deny tenure to Nikole Hannah-Jones, despite departmental support and established practice for that particular position. And I grabbed this little image here because this is a sign that is along West 96 that actually identifies the first 20 Africans in Virginia. And on the sign, it says, "A legal framework for hereditary lifelong slavery in Virginia evolved during the 1600s. That's not critical race theory, that's history. This sign has been there for quite a while. You can see here that I have a timeline. This is what historians do. We look at what's the timeline. So 1619, the first 20 Africans in Virginia. 1620, tobacco is catching on. There's a demand for labor. 1650, 300 Africans, 15,000 Virginians. 1662, this is a shift. This is a shift that historians identified long before critical race theory ever came along, that a mother's status determined the child's status. So if a mother was enslaved, then the child would be enslaved. By 1669, people who were enslaved were defined as property, just like cows, chattel slavery is what it's called. In 1675, there were 1,600 Africans and 32,000 Virginians. And then in 1690, what's called the one drop rule began and lifelong enslavement. And that one drop rule is something that meant if you had any hereditary that was heredity that was African, then you would be enslaved. And that happened over the course of the 17th century. So you can actually track that shift from indentured servitude of both whites and blacks to the enslavement of people of color. And that's something, again, historians have done. It's not something that critical race theorists look at, and they've got the foundation from historians, but that's not something that they're talking about. So what's going on? We have a backlash to history and anti-racism movements that's happening. Now, I see that we're not seeing let's see, can't see the screen for some reason. I'm not sure why that's happening. Let's see. I was just going to backlash to history and anti-racism movements. Can you see that there? There it is. Okay, great. This is a little bit different format, but it's actually pretty useful. So part of that backlash is the fear that talking about an inclusive history is something that is going to prevent people from being patriotic. Well, as a historian and a patriot, I'm going to tell you that I'm very patriotic. I believe strongly in the Constitution. I would say that inclusive and accurate histories strengthen patriotism. And they do so because they demonstrate the ways that change over time has occurred in America and how people from many backgrounds, especially those who have been historically marginalized, have come closer to achieving the promises of liberty and equality. That's one of the amazing things about history, is to look at where we came from and where we are now. It's actually pretty exciting. History answers questions related to how we got here, and it poses new questions about where we go next. But the backlash included this 1776 Commission report, which was released in January of 2021, and it was authored by an 18-member commission. There was only one professional historian on that commission, and that person was a historian of classical Greece, not the United States. Historians actually, I'm sorry. Okay, what's critical theory was asked 2 times. I'll talk about that, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay, somebody asked that, and I think that's a really great question. That's my next slide, really. The 1776 Commission defended founding fathers and slave ownership. And it was ideological and political. That's the problem. It wasn't historical. And historians look at documents from the time period, they ask questions about them, and they craft the narratives and interpretations. And there are differing interpretations. But the people who did this actually replicated ideas that were ideological and political. And so I'm not naming any names here, but it wasn't created by historians, and it was roundly rebuked by historians. It lauded the civil rights movement, but also criticized the programs that made progress possible as providing preferential treatment. And it asserted that universities are hotbeds of anti-Americanism, libel, and censorship that create disdain and hatred for America. So as someone who is in both the public school system as a board director and also has spent the last 25 years in universities, I beg to differ. So it calls for true and patriotic education. And we absolutely can have true, accurate, and patriotic education by talking about the realities of the past. So why now? Why is there this attack on critical race theory? There's a journalist and a filmmaker named Christopher Rufo, who is actually appointed at the Manhattan Institute. So he's at a think tank, who has written about critical race theory. Now, I'm going to say something. He's not someone who actually has a background in the social sciences. I actually can't find his education, to tell you the truth. I have no idea what his education is. So that's kind of odd. He wrote an article in City Journal last summer, 2020, in the middle of a very difficult, very challenging time period. And then he went on Tucker Carlson, and he made a connection between critical race theory and critical theory. And critical theory is another intellectual tradition that is grounded in Marxism. So I'm not going to say that that's not true. It was actually grounded in Marxism, but also in structuralism and post-structuralism, which is the postmodern movement of the 1990s. And I don't want to get into the weeds with all of that too much, because there's a lot of getting into the weeds right now that has nothing to do with public education or with equity in education. Those things are drawing connections between something called critical race theory and critical theory, and really critical legal theory comes out of it. So they're looking at these systems, at structures. That's how they started. So that piece of things has like seeped into everything. You can't get away from that. That's not going to change. One of the things that Christopher Rufo did was to label CRT as Marxism. And it came out of his concerns about diversity training that he had been hearing about and seeing. And so diversity training and implicit bias training was banned in the federal government in September of 2020, and then it was extended to federal contractors in January of 2021. And yes, a Washington dude. So he's actually from Washington. And there was another report that was produced by the Heritage Foundation a report on critical race theory with a man named Jonathan Butcher and Mike Gonzalez, who conflates ideas around critical theory, Marxism, and postmodernism. So they put all of these ideas that theorists, that social scientists have been talking about for literally 100 years into one basket that they're calling critical race theory, and they're saying it's being taught in schools. And I will say it again, it is not being taught in schools. How is CRT or critical theory different than the way schools teach students to think critically? Oh boy, that is a really complex question. Well, when we think critically, we deconstruct things, right? So we've been talking about critical thinking for a long time, and deconstruction really does come out of that postmodern 1990s movement, where we start saying we're going to take these things apart and think critically. So thinking critically is something that has been in the field of education, not related to Marxism, but a tradition of 100 years before that of asking questions, something that has been seen as a good thing. So people are saying, do your research. Yes, do your research. Think critically about your research. Make sure that you're not blindly accepting whatever you see online. These are really important concepts. I don't know if that answered that as well as you'd like me to, but it gets really theoretical, Barb, and that's part of the problem. And it's actually part of the goal. This Heritage Foundation report on critical race theory put a bunch of concepts together that don't belong together, and made direct connections. So for example, I had a conversation with someone, I'm going to actually talk to this person in person tomorrow, a sort of a friend of mine who I've met on Zoom, someone who's very conservative, who does understand critical theory is a technical term within sociology. It's literally graduate studies stuff. Exactly. It's absolutely graduate studies stuff, and it's very complex. Again, some of those ideas about critical thinking have seeped into our common parlance, into how we're talking about things. But the conflation, so bringing together critical race theory and critical theory and Marxism is simply inaccurate. Those things are not directly connected. There may be intellectual threads that sort of run through things, but that's how our understanding of the world works, is we learn a little bit about something, and then we ask some new questions and we build on that, but that doesn't mean it's critical race theory. So in May of 2021, states started banning critical race theory in government and in education, and there was a creation of confusion regarding terminology and the origins of ideas. So again, I'm thinking to Robin DiAngelo's book. It's something that a lot of people have read. It is not critical race theory. Robin DiAngelo is trained in what she calls whiteness studies. She probably studied some critical race theory. She also draws from a lot of other disciplines. She has examples that are individual examples. Again, critical race theory is not about the individual. So that's a key issue. So why now? Well, here's what Christopher Rufo had to say about this in March. What he said was, we have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it, Catherine Morton says, very complex ideas and systems. What's the best bottom line for concerned parents? Oh, that's a great question, Catherine. I'm going to finish this and then I'm going to answer that question. So we'll eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category. He says the goal, and this is the important piece, the goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term. So is using critical theory himself, taking the term apart, and we'll recodify it. So we're gonna brand it to bring in the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. So what's the bottom line for parents? Equity in education has nothing to do with critical race theory any more than it has to do with, our understandings of sociology, which certainly play into it, our understandings of anthropology, which also play into our understanding of education, because all of these things learn and grow. So equity in education is not about critical race theory. So that's really the bottom line. So This weaponizing of the term has strengthened culture wars. It is a red herring for diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Those things are not critical race theory. That conflation is really problematic. And we're seeing people saying that things like social emotional learning or standards-based grading or culturally responsive classroom management are critical race theory, and they're not. It's a misinterpretation of what critical race theory is as victimization and oppressor versus oppressed. I've even seen equity labeled as communism. Equity is not communism. Communism is communism, and it's an economic system. And so achievement and opportunity gaps are identified by population group are being labeled as racist. And even discussing difference is being labeled as racist. So the bottom line for parents is that what's happening here is that children and families are being politicized. The teaching of history is being politicized. Discussions of race and education are being politicized. DEI policy, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, a CRT curriculum, is being called teaching CRT. And the bottom line is this is creating community division. And that strengthens national culture wars. It doesn't benefit any of us here at all. So I'm just about done here, and then I just want to talk with you. So DEI efforts were begun to address very real documented inequities and disparities. And this anti-equity is part of an admitted and deliberate national propaganda campaign. And Christopher Rufo is the person who started it, and he's not shy about it. This media unintentionally replicates the language of CRT, even at the local level. There was an article in one of the newspapers around here that said that the Washougal School District had a CRT and equity policy. We do not have a critical race theory and equity policy. We have an equity and anti-racism policy. So what can we do? We can focus on the local level. I would ask people to please read through their district websites with an open mind. I would ask them to attend school board meetings, do citizen comment, and then stay for the entire meeting. There are presentations on programs like HiCap or changes in curriculum with detailed explanations. So stay informed and ask questions. We, the board, are actually told what's happening by teachers, by educators. They come in and talk. We have students who talk to us, talk with teachers, administrators, and your board. Carefully review sources of information. So if headlines are inflammatory, that's telling. If the language makes you feel angry, it's not a good source. Try reading across the political spectrum. Ask the experts. CRT scholars know about CRT. That's who we should be listening to about what CRT is. Historians know about history. That's who we should be listening to. Anthropologists about anthropology. Educators know about education. So recognize informational biases as well as your own. So who's the author? I told you I couldn't find Christopher Rufo's background. I couldn't find out what his education is. What sort of authority does he have to speak other than being a journalist and a filmmaker? I like to know that when I'm reading something. Are they respected in their communities? And then ask questions. Why would teachers or administrators have a hidden agenda? Why would they? I know I certainly don't. I'm being very straightforward about my agenda and who I am. My agenda is to educate children and to educate the community as best I can to help us understand together. Disagree with specifics rather than taking on national narratives that divide our communities. And talk to people in the community who disagree with you and ask them why. I'm going to be having a conversation with this person tomorrow who disagrees about where critical race theory comes from. So we're going to have a good talk. And then participate. I hope we can try to remember that we're all part of the same community. So that's where I'm going to end my talking, and I'd like to see what some of the questions are that I should address. And let's see. This is kind of a different format. I see. Okay, here we go. Let's see. So can I define critical theory? Critical theory and critical race theory are not the same thing. Critical theory comes out of a whole group of writers and intellectuals in the late 19th, early 20th century that kind of build on Marxism. It's not critical race theory, and that's really the key issue here. Postmodernism is something that arose in the 1990s. John Stevens says, weaponizing fear. Open conversation with your kids around the dinner table will be helpful for you and your kids. Let's see. Nice. Oh, here we go. It's a debate between people who think children shouldn't be burdened with the past and those who want kids to learn how the legacy of that past shapes American society today. Is our national history merely a tool to inspire patriotism, or is it, as historians argue, a valuable lesson in the good, the bad, and the ugly? As this new front in the culture wars show, our understanding of the past is a key factor in how we envision our future. So this is a story about the story and the myths. That's certainly something that we talk about in history. Yeah, so very complex ideas and systems. What's the best bottom line for concerned parents? Again, I hope I see Catherine Morton's comment here again. You know, this is really a situation where I think it's really important to build trust as much as possible by talking with the people who are involved. Talk with your teacher students. If there's something that you don't like, talk with them about that. But I know the Camas School District put out a statement just yesterday about not having a hidden agenda. So I think it's really unfortunate that there's an idea that's being fed into by national narratives. They have nothing to do with what we're doing here on the ground, that are telling us that we can't trust each other because we're all part of this community. So talk to the people who are involved. Talk to your teachers. Again, go to those board meetings and actually find out what's happening at the board. That's how, when I decided to get involved in this, I started going to board meetings, and you know, board meetings are like 2 and 3 hours long. That's how we learn what's happening in our school districts. Are there other questions or comments? Let's see. I'm not sure if I can see them all here. Let's see. Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? All right. Well, Jackie's back. So Jackie, are there things that you observed or questions that you have or that anybody in the room there had? Oh, I can't hear you.
That would be because I was on mute.
Yep. The classic term from 2020, 2021. I'm on mute. You're on mute.
Right. I think you did a really great job explaining everything. You know, Patty's here with us and she says, talk and listen to those involved with the school districts. I totally agree. It's been such a lovely just evening having you here. It's left me with, you know, a clear definition of kind of what we're talking about as we move forward. And it's just been an amazing experience. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here and to chat with us and to present the information that you have. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you, Jackie. And thanks to everyone who tuned in after days on Zoom. I know we're all really tired of staring at screens, and I appreciate you all listening to me. These are really complex. They're really, really complex issues. And in some ways, that's kind of that's the problem, right? Is that we are, and yes, Rob, I can supply slides. I'm happy to supply the slides. And I've actually included some YouTube, some, you know, from some CRT scholars. People are saying, here's what CRT is, if people want to understand more. I think that's really important. But it's really complicated because people who go to graduate school learn about critical theory, learn about, again, I'm going to make something very clear. I did not learn about critical race theory as part of my graduate studies. I was writing a dissertation in which Derek Bell, who was the originator of critical race theory, came and did a program for the U.S. Forest Service as they were trying to diversify their workforce. And that's where I was like, oh, what is this critical race theory thing? So I read a little bit about it then. So I didn't just hear about it. And so I think that's really important. A lot of us are hearing about this. This is not something that has been commonly spoken about. So Paul Spear asked if we thought about how to share this more broadly. I believe we're recording. Isn't that true? Yeah, we're recording this, Paul. And so we'll ask people to share it. And Patty wants our conversation with communities to continue. I think that's a cue for you, Jackie.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're all about here at Live Well. So this is the first in the series of this conversation, Camas, so you want to talk about. It'll be an ongoing monthly conversation. We'll be covering a broad spectrum of topics. Our next live event is going to be Friday, July 9th at 6 p.m., so 2 weeks from now. And we'll be kind of continuing a little bit on this conversation from tonight and also moving things forward and learning some new things. So I'm super excited about that. And then we have a panel discussion coming up in August, which will be awesome. And then moving into the fall, we're going to have conversations on with some of the local farmers in the area on food justice and food sovereignty. And so I'm really excited about that. So yeah, lots of good things to come. Like I said, this is just the first in a series of conversations that we'll have. And we're hoping to just continue to build community in this way, because community comes through understanding.
Well, if anyone is interested in getting my presentation, my email address is historygal517@gmail.com. That's historygal517@gmail.com. Yes, it's a cheesy email address, but it tells you how I identify. I do not identify as a critical race theorist. I identify as a historian. So feel free to reach out, or if you want to have a conversation, a further conversation. I haven't done a great job defining critical theory, because this isn't about critical theory. This is about a conversation related to what's happening in our public schools. And critical theory and critical race theory is not what's happening in our public schools.
Yeah. So you can connect with us, LibWell Camas, on social media. We're at LibWell Camas on all platforms, pretty easy to find. You can find our schedule of events and our classes at libwellcamas.com. Don't forget to share this video. It is being recorded. It'll be available on both our YouTube channel and our Facebook page. So, do all of the things. Share it, like it, subscribe, comment, all of those things. If you subscribe to the YouTube channel or like our Facebook page, then you'll be sure to be in the loop when our next important conversation comes about.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And the only other thing I'd like to say is that we're all here because we care about kids, whether we're parents, teachers, confused people about what's happening. We all care about the kids, and that needs to remain our focus and our goal. So thanks for giving me an opportunity to participate at that level.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for being here, for tuning in, for offering your questions, your comments. I so appreciate it. If we did not get a chance to answer your question, we'll be answering some questions in the comment section on both our Facebook page and our YouTube page in the next day or so as we sort through them. So thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, stay healthy, happy, and curious. Have a great evening.